Okay, class. Now I'm going to tell you a little bit about my own personal story and my own personal life. So you can look at the kind of the schema that I just gave. This is my life and flow, and I've done this as a graphic novel. And the premise is a chronological journey of the human psyche. The MacGuffin, what we're looking for, is the transcendent flow, optimal experience where the self merges with action. And I'm the protagonist of my own story, just as Jung was the protagonist in the Red Book. This is my unconscious, integrating Jungian psychology and Zen Buddhism. So, 1966, The Lonely Roots. This is me as a kid with the trees. The origin story, a lonely childhood marked by abandonment. To survive the silence of a distant veteran father and an absent mother, the protagonist retreats into the wild. Yeah, my father was in the South Pacific and jumping from island to island in World War II and was really wounded by that. And when I was around 10, he was really drinking a lot and there was a lot going on. Key insight, shutting down the default mode network, the inner critic, to find flow in nature. So I remember sitting when climbing on the cypress trees in Seaside, Monterey, Salinas. There's a lot of cypress trees and they're really close together and you could really leap like Tarzan. And I remember getting into the flow and hearing the trees talk to me when I wasn't really connected with my parents. So the trees became my mother. And the tree said to me, "My name is Mother." The cypress whispered, "My roots go super deep. Reach for the sky." So the trees were encouraging me and starting me on this path to becoming a psychologist. I wanted to be an astronaut, but I decided to go into inner space because I couldn't go into outer space. Okay. The split persona. And I talked a little bit about this before. The ape man, that's the emotion and the instinct. That was my first self that I developed. But that part was getting into trouble. It was too primitive or too not sophisticated enough. So by 9 to 10, or 10, I needed to realize that I needed to develop this other side. So I would be suave and fixated. I'm looking in literature and film. I read all the Tarzan books that my Aunt Dorothy gave me. I started reading around 10, 11. Maybe that was too early, but all about James Bond. And then I started in high school, and that's where we were the Cowboys, the Salinas Cowboys, which is a patriarchal mask of dominance and objectifying your body and everybody else's body as a athlete. To survive adolescence, the psyche fractures into defensive archetypes. So these are my 3 defensive archetypes. The secret agent used reason to conceal the emotional swings of Tarzan. Tarzan is extroverted feeling. James Bond is introverted thinking. The cowboy provided the persona of patriarchal dominance, that I was supposed to be the man, and yeah, we can hear about that. So then in 1978, I got a football scholarship to St. Mary's College and somehow got turned around into the Great Books program. I was the only person ever to be in the Great Books program and on the football team. St. Mary's College, the clash of identities. So the conflict, brute force of the cowboy body versus the intellectual curiosity of the spy. So you can see me there with my shirt there, Oxy, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Plato, Kant, Nietzsche, and the football helmet on the other side. It was like split between those 2 aspects of myself in college. This is my college language professor, Dr. Dragstead. In the Great Books program, we learned Greek in the first year. We learned Latin in the second year. We learned German in the third year, to read Hegel in German. And then I think it was French we read in the last year. So we had a bet with Occidental when I was the captain of the team my freshman year, which is really unusual. But we won the game, and so I got the Oxy shirt. And I wore that to class because I was really proud of it. And Professor Dragstead said, "Mr. Lippincott, you must be an oxymoron." And I had no idea what an oxymoron was, but I learned a lot from Mr. Dragstead, but he would always, I will say, his quips to me, he was always challenging me, and his quips were like peacekeeping missiles. So they really hit you hard, but for a good reason, to keep you calm. Integrating the ape, the instinct, and the spy the logos, to create the whole man. Okay. Now, 1981, and this is one of my first clients ever, was a child named Ronald at Lincoln Child Center in Oakland. And if you know where that is, that's way up on the hill, but it goes right down Lincoln Avenue and you go across Fruitvale, which is a very dangerous street to cross. We had a kid, I had a kid, 8-year-old kid, who had witnessed his mother brutally murdered in the apartment, maybe a year or two before I met him. And he was alone for 4 days, alone with his mother's body. He wouldn't leave it. And the stench, the smell got so bad the neighbors came and found him. And he was wild. I mean, and he would literally, he wasn't exactly suicidal. I call it passive suicidal or psychological suicide or whatever. In other words, he just didn't care about himself. So he would literally get a skateboard and go down this huge hill and cross Fruitvale and with all kinds of traffic. He had basically a death wish, which is a counterphobic machine testing its limits of what he could survive. He didn't, but it was really that he didn't care if he lived. I remember one day we had a psychiatrist. And we were all consulting with the psychiatrist, and we were talking about Ronald. Synchronicity, we look out the window, and he's on the fourth floor, tiptoeing across the roof. And that's an unconscious suicidal ideation. He wasn't consciously, he just didn't care about himself. And key insight methodology was the squiggle. The squiggle technique is a relational art therapy technique where you put a squiggle on the piece of paper and the client puts a squiggle. So Ronald put a squiggle and I put a squiggle, and then I had to make something out of his squiggle. Like he'd make a snake out of the squiggle that I make, and I would make him going down the hill on a wave on his squiggle, whatever. But that was turning random lines into art to bypass trauma. That was a way of connecting with him without challenging him his defenses. And you can see in his face here just how he's really in a flow state and he's concentrating, but it's a negative flow state that's really dangerous, which can happen a lot. Key insight, learning that emptiness can be a space for connection. Turning the gritty machinery of the soul, tuning into his empath. What that's talking about is empath. That's where I first learned about the term empathic attunement. I had to feel what Ronald would feel, and when he eventually told me what it was like, and the smells and all those things, that was a lot for me to handle when I was just starting out. But you all are going to have that experience in practicum and as you become therapists. Now the yellowing. And this is the yellowing is a stage that James Hillman would talk about a lot. And I worked later on in my private practice with a young woman, Tammy, who was and this is when she was 16 and got pregnant, and her dad was a minister. So that didn't go over too well with the congregation and everything. Now, everybody called her Tammy, but her actual name was Tamar, which is a very interesting mythological term because Tamar was a woman who Judah did not allow her to get married to her husband, so she had to become a prostitute, and finally Judah realized how wonderful she was and gave her permission. And she's one of the few women, I think there's only 3 women in the line of Jesus, and Tamar is the first one. Anyway, this Tamar was a pregnant teen judged by her community. The theme, the breakdown of the false self required before the self can emerge. So I used to say, remember, every victory for the self means a defeat of the ego. Jung would say that all the time, and I would repeat it. Every victory for the self means a defeat of the ego. But Tina Stromstead, who's a really famous, wonderful Jungian analyst in San Francisco, I'm doing a lot of training with. She's the inventor of a lot of dance, authentic movement, has been doing it for she's in her 80s now, I think. But she says, every success for the self means a sacrifice by the ego. I like that a lot better. Okay, instead of every victory means a defeat, every success for the self means a sacrifice by the ego. I feel like that's a positive way of looking at it. So the foul gas, and she comes in and says, my life sucks, it stinks, it's awful. That's when we knew that the yellowing was coming, that particular stage where it's just starting to move towards gold, starting to move towards the reddening, the foul gas of sulfur bringing an uncomfortable necessary change. And so James Hillman was my professor at Pacifica. And this is us having lunch together. And we had some real soup, some really bean soup that was excellent. And we had a gourmet chef lived there at the campus, right above where Kevin Costner was. But the setting is Pacifica Graduate Institute, the archetype, Hillman as the cynics, the wise old man. And this was in 1991. The lesson, learning to see through the literal to the archetypal, the precursor to understanding group flow. So there he's talking to me about it, and we're discussing and eating this bean soup. Well, we go into this little class, and he's teaching in this small little class, and I had a big fart, and Hillman said, I see the yellowing has started already. That's a kind of an alchemical joke, but I guess you might have to be there to get the joke. But the shadow of loss. This is me meeting my wife, and we went to a lecture. And on the way to the lecture, we had to stop by. We were going to San Francisco to a lecture, but part of the reason why we decided to go to this lecture is lecture was about 6, about 2 in the afternoon. We had to go meet with a neurosurgeon, and we got a brain tumor diagnosis for my wife. The narrative beat, the ache of loss dims the world. The hero's journey shifts from conquest to endurance. So, and John Beebe, the famous Jungian analyst, came out as being gay at this, he was the first out gay Jungian analyst, and even in San Francisco, that was the first place. But now there's a lot of gay analysts that are out. But at that time, it was a lot more difficult. And the hero's journey shifts from conquest to endurance. 1993, the courage to be. John Beebe publicly coming out gay during a lecture. Initial reaction. Visceral fear meets courage, moving from the fantasy of curing the shadow, that's St. George, you're going to defeat it, to the maturity of living with it. So there's going to be losses in life. And I was experiencing a big loss during that time. My wife was really getting sick at this point. 1996, I had a case of a dream of a vampire. Context therapy with Heidi at St. George Homes, the work, reenactment therapy, exploring no man's land of shame and trauma to find the real self. Okay, and the vampire was the bloodsucker. That was her identity, and I've talked a little bit about that. And that was dissociation and her search for her identity. Now, in the 90s, too, that was when the film, my daughter would watch this TV show called Buffy the Vampire Slayer, because there was a real change in the concept of femininity and women during this whole 80s, 90s, the whole feminism thing was really there, and we were really changing some of our psychological ideas. So before this, vampires had usually preyed on women, like the bride of Dracula, or the Dracula sucking your blood or whatever. But in the 90s, we had Buffy the Vampire Slayer, which was really a shift in the psyche of women taking power from the negative forces that were being projected on them, which we could talk on and on about that. Maybe we should talk about that in social justice class. Okay. The zombie in 1996. The archetype, zombies, mindless adherent to expectations. The breakthrough, using Madonna's Papa Don't Preach to break the spell. And zombies are homeless, as I talked about before, and this is a kind of a symbol of that in my own life, working with people. The key concept, family flow, moving from unconscious fusion to conscious connection, making the unconscious conscious, but also allowing for differentiation and individuation within the children in the family as they grew. They escaped from that power that was holding them back. 2024, the science of flow. And this is me with Stephen Kotler talking about flow. I did a lot of training. I was in his writer's workshop for a year, which is a big part where my book finally came together. I'd been living for 40 years to write the book, but it was Stephen Kotler's help that helped me do that. The modern era, mastery and coaching, collaboration, Jungian depth psychology with the hard neuroscience of flow research collective. The crumbling Victorian, and this is something I went through when I had to have surgery, facing our current medical system was daunting. I mean, you're hurting all over. You have to have your knees replaced, your hips replaced, pacemakers, all that. And you've got to deal with this, what we called, my family calls the Stephen King Hospital. It's like you get there at 6 in the morning for surgery and it takes an hour to even find somebody. The walls were literally, it was that cold of a place. Gone, gone, altogether gone. I would be in the infinite pieces and one with everything. So if you think about it, having no self and being one with everything are kind of different sides of the same coin. The theme, confront mortality, the final integration, the dissolution of the ego and the acceptance of death as the ultimate flow state. That was when you go through surgery, you remember minor surgery is surgery on somebody else. So now the conclusion. This is through all these experiences that led me to come up with the idea of family flow, which I talked about at the end of the lecture. Little part of the lecture I just gave. You have to have alignment, values in the family that are the same. You have to have cohesion, teamwork, and autonomy. Each person has to have their own identity. When you have all three of those things, that's where you get into that sweet spot of family flow. And my paper, which was published last fall, Cultural Critique of Participation, Mystique, and Helping Families Find Flow. The theory, moving from participation, mystique, unconscious fusion, where you're just like my way or the highway, you're just fused with your family and you can't think for yourself, to flow, where you are connected with your family, but you have your own conscious self. The outcome, turning the lead of trauma into the gold of relationship. Clinical psychologist, the mission is the Bodhisattva vow, using personal suffering from and the integration of the ape and spy to help others navigate their jungles. My parts as a whole can help the earth swing on a branch of love. I hope that was interesting for you and not too boring, and it tells you a little bit about my own personal journey and some of my own personal philosophy. So thank you very much, and I really enjoy teaching this. And if you have any questions, you can ask me after class, after you watch this, or you can write me a comment, and I will answer all the comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you.